Okay, good morning and welcome to our fifth and last webinar on the informal economy. I'm Paolo Carlini, the team leader of the Research Network and Support Facility. It's an EU-funded project working on the informal economy, doing research and giving assistance to 15 projects funded by the EU thematic program Investing in People, which are related to the informal economy. Today, we are going to present some of the good practices that we have highlighted and identified during almost 4 years of the project. There is a lot of material that we have and it's available. So after Jacques' presentation, I'm going to show very briefly what documents are available and where. So if you are interested to go in depth in some of the topics related to the informal economy, or to have more details on the good practices identified, or even if you want to go more in depth on the other topics that we have addressed during the previous webinars, the definition of the informal economy, the key concepts, the trends, or topics like social protection for informal workers or organizing informal workers, you will have a reference in order to get access to this material. Today we have here Jacques Charme. Jacques is our research expert. He's an economist and statistician and was the former director of the Institute of Research for Development, the IRD in Paris. He's been working since the 70s in the field of the informal economy, and today he's going to present a sample of the work that we have done on the identification of good practices related to the informal economy. We also have here Pierre Berman, our communication expert, and I would ask you, Pierre, before starting, as usual, to give participants, especially if we have newcomers, some technical advice on how to use the platform for this webinar and how to interact during the process. Thank you, Pierre.
Sure, Paolo. So first of all, welcome to everyone in this webinar. We are very happy to have you here. And I would like just quickly to thank you for your participation. Also to thank all those of you who have also participated to our previous webinars, and some of you have also sent in advance their questions, their comments on the topic of this webinar, and we thank you for your input. All the discussions, all the material that will be presented during this webinar will be available on the website of our community of practice, the ISF group. You are invited to join if you want to, and you will have all the details in the emails you have received and the one you will receive afterwards. Of course, you can also follow us on our social accounts, so Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. During this webinar, you will be able to attend to listen to the presentations of Jacques and Paolo. You will also have the opportunity to participate. To do that, you can participate in 3 different ways. During the webinar, you can participate through the chat box or the question box. They are on the control panel, which should be on your right. I will be following all the questions and comments you will share with us, and make sure that we address them during the webinar or after the webinar. We will try to have at the end of the webinar, according to the time, we will a question and answer session, and you will have the possibility during this Q&A to ask to use the feature raise your hand. You see on your control panel there is a small hand like this. You can click on it, and then I can not only read your question, but also in that case give you the floor so that you can ask directly your question. Then, of course, if you have any technical issue in terms of connection, in terms of hearing or watching the webinar, do not hesitate to message me. You have the possibility to do that in the chat box. And please note that at the end of the presentation, there will be a small survey that in which we will ask you your feedback on the webinar. And also note that at the end of the webinar, as soon as it's processed, all the recording of this webinar and also all the presentations of the webinar will be posted on our website. Once again, if you have any problem, do not hesitate to message me, and have a good webinar. Oh, we don't hear you, Paolo.
Yes, for your explanation. And with no further delays, I would give the floor to Jacques Charme for our presentation. He's going to, as I said, present a sample of good practices on the informal economy, identified, analyzing projects and experiences all over the world. Please, Jacques.
Thank you, Paolo. Hello, everybody. Good morning. So, in this fifth and last webinar, I'm going to present to you some good practices extracted from the projects that we have been studying during the course of the Research Network Support Facility. At RNSF, we have been defining good practices with 6 criteria. A good practice has to be effective and successful. It has to be environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. It has to be gender sensitive, technically feasible, inherently participatory, and replicable and adaptable. Well, having said that, how can we decide whether a good practice is good or not? Sorry. I'm sorry. So it will be useful to use a scoring system to measure the extent to which the good practice meets the criteria. And this would enable us to a comparative analysis of the good practices. But scoring is not an easy exercise, and it is quite subjective because it depends on the experience and the knowledge of the researcher, the person who scores. So we didn't do that at RNSF. And all the more so that the project duration is generally short, 3 to 4 years, which is not sufficient. To ensure that the action will be sustained over the long term. Ideally, a good practice must be time-tested to prove that its impact endures over time. So the identification of good practices is usually based on either on qualitative or quantitative data that the actors of the projects themselves make available through internal and external reports. And there are also researchers who conduct analysis of such reports, and evaluators of the projects who identify good practices and lessons learned through analysis of field-level results using a combination of interviews, focus group discussions, observations, surveys, and document analysis. So in practice, the application of the above criteria is difficult and remains subjective. Comparisons between the situation before the project and at the end of the project or after the project can be based on ad hoc baseline survey conducted by the persons implementing the projects, and also at the end of the project using the criteria proposed by them in the initial proposal to assess the achievements. Also, experimental economics can also compare the situation of the beneficiary populations at the beginning and at the end of the project with comparable non-beneficiary population in the same areas. You may remember, for those of you who have attended the previous webinars, that in the course of these webinars we have presented already some of the good practices identified by RNSF. It was the case for women shea nuts producers in Ghana, about climbing up the value chain. It was the case of Togo, the delegation for the organization of the informal sector, and the means that this delegation used to collect the contribution for social protection. The groups of savings and community solidarity, GESCO, in Côte d'Ivoire, also for collecting contribution to medical coverage. The good practice of Uganda in the recognition of technical skills acquired in the informal economy. And finally, in Bogota, the struggle of waste pickers for the recognition of their right to apply for a bid launched by the municipality with the support of WIGO. Now, here we are going to use 4 volumes that the RNSF project edited, and that will be available on the website of ISF. And Paolo will come back to this at the end of this presentation, so I will not insist. Just a few words to say that depending on the fact that the project we analyze are EU funded or funded by other institutions, we have been in the position of using primary data to evaluate these projects. By primary data, I mean the initial application form of the project, the interim reports, the final narrative reports of the projects, and finally the final evaluation report. So this primary data was available for all the EU-funded projects we had access to, and also for the other projects funded by other institutions, it was only secondary data, that is, reports prepared by these international institutions or bilateral donors to evaluate the project that they funded. We have selected for this presentation 5 categories of good practices. The first category, illustrated by Ghana, the women shea nut producers, on which we will come back in more details than in the previous webinars, is a project that has been completed and for which we have all the primary data. The second project is extracted from non-EU funded projects. It is about Ethiopians fighting against child exploitative labor with the Safe Threads program. So for this, we had only secondary data. The third kind of project and good practices we have identified is not directly related to the informal economy. It is the support to strengthening the capacity of civil registration system in Niger. Finally, the fourth category of good practices is extracted from one of the 17 projects which have been partnering with RNSF along the course of our project, and which were completed just at the end of our project. It is the promotion of livelihoods and inclusion of vulnerable women, domestic workers, and women small-scale traders in Kenya. And a fifth category of good practices we will present is extracted from the wide literature on the subject. It is the BRAC good practice about targeting the ultra-poor program. Now, let's enter into more details about the Ghana projects, about market access through cooperative action on women shea nut producers that has been implemented by Planet Finance, funded by the EU, and which is interesting because it is a multi-pronged approach. That is a holistic approach that is very interesting. So, as you know, shea nut is the fruit of a tree which grows in the bush of the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. The shea nut and butter value chain is a dynamic niche of the cosmetics market. So it's a very cheap fruit which ends in a very expensive cosmetic on the market of the northern countries. So Planet Finance supported poorer women shea producers who take their margins from collecting shea nuts, removing pulp and drying them to perform additional activities in the value chain. Such activities included trade, gathering the products in bulk, and increasing efforts to meet the quality and the quantity demands of large buyers. The multi-pronged approach implemented to climb up the value chain, including increasing the volume and the quality, the provision of awareness raising, organizing the small producers in community groups, providing education and training, providing access to credit, using information technology to access market operations and manage operations and transactions, and build contractual relationships with international buyers and other actors in the value chain. So these are all the activities of the project that we are going to present now. So the first good practice concerned the private sector intermediation through the social and solidarity economy. In the course of the project, a creative approach to improving chain governance was implemented. A social private company, the Shea Star Limited, SSL, was set up in which the women have shares through the Star Shea network. SSL offers marketing services to the numerous member groups. It also searches international markets for nuts and butter buyers and takes in charge the commercialization of the shea products that the women sell in bulk. This approach enables progress on increased savings and investments, and SSL also managed to process refined shea butter through a tolling arrangement in Europe before sale to final clients. So these significantly increased the volume of the unrefined shea butter that women were able to sell. SSL plays a major role in supporting and assisting the women to fulfill the protocols for fair trade. as well as in providing them with some key inputs such as packaging and pre-financing. The project and women producer groups established contractual relationships to sell to the major international buyers. The SSL helped to increase their number during the course of the project. The community association members participate in the negotiation and distribution within the network. They also supervise the quality of nuts and butter through a quality assurance system, and they participate in the aggregation of products at approved warehouses. Occasionally, groups may have declined to process particular butter orders due to less motivating market prices, and in other cases, they bargain to receive higher prices, thus proving the empowerment in analyzing market prices. Women producers were allowed to continue to sell their production to local markets as well and to other buyers, but they were committed to the arrangements with SSL. This is because bulk selling enables them to put their earnings to good use, such as for the payment of school fees, the purchase of household assets, and working and farming tools. So regarding whether the social enterprise model is working well, one could state that women producers are not always able to meet all orders from buyers. And when this happens, what is interesting is that they must buy nuts or butter from other women who are not members of their groups. But this has resulted in interesting cascading effects in that the required quality from the outside women pushed the beneficiaries of the project to share with them their improved practices. A second domain of good practices in this Ghana project is about social protection. In Ghana, the national health insurance system was successfully involved in facilitating the registration and membership card renewal of the project beneficiaries. For that, to this aim, they have been using a combination of sensitization, logistics support, and techniques for facilitating registration and organizing women producers to reach the goal of improved access to these public services. So meetings with the staff of the insurance scheme were organized at regional offices to convince them to participate in sensitizing clients on the importance of the insurance schemes and help them understand that the project valued their role as the service providers. So they were provided with logistic supports such as vehicle and the public address system. They were facilitated in their travel to the sites for mass registrations. The staff of the insurance scheme gave presentation on the role of their institutions and the benefits for the population in the project field sites. The staff were asked numerous questions since many women were unaware of the existence of these health insurance schemes. They also had to listen to complaints about the non-delivery of cards or the late delivery of these cards, and the difficulties in renewing cards, as well about frustrations that card bearers encountered at various delivery points. This exposure helped make the NHIS staff more aware of the harsh conditions of remote and vulnerable populations. Techniques for facilitating registrations included getting women to make contribution in installments towards the registrations and the renewals. It also included the scheduling bulk registrations in the communities, thus extending registrations operations beyond the beneficiaries of the project themselves. Project officers also contributed by picking up the expired cards of women and bringing them to their offices. Women producers have been organized in community social funds that were connected to microfinance institutions to obtain financial support to help them for NHSI's registration. This allowed the community members to share their health risks as they can pool resources together through the access to healthcare. An increased attendance to health facilities has been observed with earlier treatment of sicknesses and diseases. And NHSS officials now travel to renew expired cards and register new clients as a result of the collaboration between their scheme and the SHE associations. So if you remember well, this was a good practices that we highlighted in previous webinars. It means that it is not to the beneficiaries or to the poor population to go to the offices of the health insurance or of the various administrations, but it is rather to the administration to go to these people and try to support them in order to have a better access to the services. Another category of good practices in this, still in this Ghana project, was about occupational safety and health. As you know, OSH is not only an issue in large factories or work sites, but it is also an issue in traditional rural agriculture and other informal activities, informal economy activities. Among the multi-pronged strategies for climbing up the value chain of SHE-Nut, the project aimed to better protect women producers in their task of gathering nuts from the SHE trees and of processing the nuts. Through their community groups and with the support of microcredit within the project, women received suitable equipment and training on safety and protection that has resulted in a dramatic reduction of the incidence of life-threatening events in their work practices. The use of protective clothing, and especially boots and gloves, considerably reduced snake bites during nut picking. And similarly, the use of energy-efficient stoves for nut and butter processing had an impact on reducing burns resulting from open fires and exposure to heat and smoke, improving working conditions and health status. Another domain of good practices still in the Ghana project was the use of ICT. ICT can play a major role in value chain strategies because the knowledge of market prices helps inform sellers of the best times to sell their products. So many producers, sellers lack such information which could be easily obtained through cell phones. One of the actions of the project was to effectively link up the women sheep producers with their market and strengthen the efficiency of the sheep supply chain. Women groups were facilitating to acquire mobile phones through members' contributions. Women saw cell phones acquisition as an asset, so that the groups were ready to invest in acquiring them. And the phones were used to receive price alerts on chosen markets to keep women informed of the prices of shea nuts and butter received from the buyers. They could then use the information as a decision-making tool to determine the best time to sell. So all group leaders were trained on price information system. They acquired knowledge on the benefits of receiving access to price information, on how to convert local measurement units to kilograms, and so be able to interpret prices expressed per kilo, and understand the use and management of the mobile phone in interpreting and decoding alerts. The phones were also used to receive and send information on supply of produce, date of aggregation of individual collections and pickup, and also to receive information from the microfinance institutions on meetings, disbursements, installments, dates for loans. Initially, alerts were used to be sent to every group weekly, but this was changed to one alert per community or several groups bi-weekly. This was because all groups in a community depended on the same literate secretary to translate the information to them. And finally, the last domain of good practice in this Ghana project was, of course, microcredit. The project, what is original in this Ghana project is that the support was provided to microfinance institutions in their holistic approach to development. The project helped them to target the poor rural women engaged in agro-processing and whom traditional financial institutions normally avoid. So one of the actions carried out was to provide technical support to partner microfinance institutions to refine and develop new credit products. Such products enable clients to acquire appropriate business inputs, pay the premium of the health insurance scheme, or stabilize their incomes throughout the year. Several lessons were learned from previous experience. Microfinance institutions providing group loans need to develop specific internal competencies in order to effectively provide financial services in a value chain framework. Sustainability of these institutions also depend on their capacity to offer better timely loans in relation to the shea nut value chain. MFIs can also feel harmed by some actors in the chain, such as bulk buyers, who may have the potential to offer more competitive pre-financing services, and also the burdening of MFIs loan officers limits the effectiveness of their actions. So they participate in the formation of production groups that was decided in order to increase sense of ownership and willingness to provide financial services. And it was also decided to improve their efficiency through the provision of training in specific software for the management of the loan process. A total of 4 loan products were developed: nuts working capital loan, butter working capital loan, roaster loan, and grinding mill loan. The use of rosters has led to an increase in quality and productivity in butter processing. So MFI staff were trained, and they themselves train women beneficiaries. So with Planet Finance support, the MFIs have been able to provide their staff with motorbikes, laptops, and microloan management software. The staff of MFIs described this assistance as highly beneficial because it provided them with an enabling environment to operate. And they explained that their capacities in key areas, such as loan management, were improved. Now, a second category of good practices is extracted from a project funded by other institutions that the EU. In collaboration with the government, the project eFace strive to create a child-safe label for products in order to increase the connectivity with international textile markets. Simple weavers of textiles in Ethiopia would not be able to connect with the designers supplying foreign buyers in Europe and America due to a reputation for dependence on exploitative child labor. And so many textiles companies and fashion designers didn't want anymore to source their materials from Ethiopia because of this employment of child labor. Through the program known as Safe Threads, domestic producers of textiles who do not use exploitative child labor can go to the government, and after proving that their means of production are child safe, they can receive the Safe Threads certification. When these firms are certified, international buyers should feel more comfortable buying from them, and thus empowering the local weavers. Weavers continue to be monitored to ensure that they do not employ children in the course and after the end of the project. This practice motivates business to formalize themselves, as it provides large benefit for doing so. Another type of good practices that is extracted from EU-funded project, but this time not directly related to the informal economy, is the support to civil registration system in Niger by UNICEF with the fundings of the EU. As you know, informality is roughly defined by and limited to the non-registration of the enterprise or the activity operated by the person. But in many developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the countries where rural population are dominant, these populations are not registered because of the lack of an efficient civil status registration. When a boy or a girl is born without civil status, it means that he or she will be unable to claim for his or her rights because the person cannot provide the proof of name, age, residence, nationality, etc. Again, when the person marries without civil status, there is no proof of marital status that can be brought, and finally, when he or she dies without civil status, their heirs will not be able to claim for the ownership of the land or of the house. The rule of law, with its rights, freedoms, and obligations, can apply if and only if citizens have a legal existence. So the project focused on conducting training and incentivizing local and central administration, civil status registration, health services, to search and convince populations to register birth, marriages, and death in order to secure the key protection rights during the person's lifespan. So the good practices consisted in outreaching campaigns, forensic audiences during traditional meetings or at school, and motivation of officials in charge of this civil registration. Some example of opportunities for people were given to people to share their experiences in these forensic audiences or campaigns. For instance, Umaru was able to tell that those who went to gold sites in Niger had to come back because they had not identity card. A village teacher said that he didn't accept children to be registered at school if they had not a birth certificate. A couple witnesses that they were rejected at the border because they had not a marriage certificate, and another couple indicates that a death certificate allowed them to obtain the tax relief. Matron explained that thanks to her birth certificate, she got an identity card and consequently received money thanks to the proof of affiliations with a deceased parent. So these are examples of when an identity card or a birth certificate are necessary to have access to the rights of the person. The last category of good practices is extracted from one of the 17th projects that have been partnering with RNSF. It is a project implemented by Oxfam in Kenya on promoting livelihoods and inclusion of vulnerable women domestic workers and women small-scale traders. The main objective of this project have been to give citizen voices and to put these voices at the center of public service delivery through public participation. Support were given to women to demand their rights to basic services from the government with regard to water and sanitation and early childhood education, among other issues. Most of the city's informal economy workers live in the slums that were targeted, and the project contributed to the development of the Nairobi City County Public Participation Act, which was accepted into a law in 2016. And targeted women were continuously educated on the provisions and mobilized to participate in spaces created for citizen voices to be heard. The use of social media to advocate for rights of women domestic workers and women small-scale traders can be highlighted. It is the case for the project trained women on how to use social media for influencing and advocacy. For instance, domestic workers are now using WhatsApp to report violations by their employers or to mobilize their peers for joint advocacy actions. Influencing the government of Kenya to take concrete steps for the ratification of ILO Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers was one of the third orientations of the project, and it was successfully achieved in the course of the project. And finally, the last good practices that I wanted to highlight in this webinar is not extracted from one of the projects we have been following in the RNSF, but it is extracted from the wider literature on the good practices in the informal economy and for poor population. It concerns BRAC's targeting ultra-poor program. BRAC stands for Building Resources Across Communities, initially Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee. It is the largest NGO for development in the world and reaches more than 126 million people in 14 countries. In 2002, BRAC developed the Targeting the Ultra-Poor program through a graduation approach after noticing that the social safety nets failed to reach the extremely poor. So the approach addresses the social, economic, and health needs of poor families simultaneously by combining the satisfaction of immediate needs with longer-term interventions in life and skills training, asset transfers, enterprise development, and savings towards more sustainable livelihoods. TIUP presents the advantage of a strong and reliable and empirical evaluation, on which I will come back. So the beneficiaries were selected through a participatory process. They were given a productive asset chosen from a list and the corresponding training, as well as life skills training and consumption support during a given period. They had access to saving schemes and health services, and all these supports were supposed to provide the households with a big push for a self-employment activity. The program is costly because it reached an amount per household which is equivalent to its consumption as measured by the baseline survey. So it means that during the course of the project, the households have received an amount which is equivalent to their full consumption during the course of the project. So it's a really big push. So BRAC implements two approaches, one for the specially targeted ultra-poor who receive the productive assets directly, and the second for the other targeted ultra-poor who are marginally less deprived and who receive the soft loan for acquiring the asset. So this is the graph describing the activities of the ultra-poor program, and you will note a domain which is called the social integration, which is community mobilization, and the committees for village poverty reduction. Finally, in Bangladesh, the program has reached more than 600,000 households, and its replication was decided in 20 countries. In 2006, the approach was adapted and tested in 8 countries, and this is where we have this evaluation technique that I was talking about previously. A randomized evaluation through controlled trials was conducted in 6 of these countries: India, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Ghana, Honduras, Peru. The results of which have been published in a very famous scientific journal, Science, looking at the progress at the end of the program and 1 year later. Measuring the impact of the program was made on 10 key outcomes: consumption of the households, food security, productive and household assets, financial inclusions, time use, income and revenues, physical health, mental health, political involvement, and women's empowerment. And the study found significant impact on all of them, on all of these outcomes, 1 year after the end of the project, or 3 years after the transfer of the productive assets. And in 5 out of 6 countries, the extra earnings exceeded the program cost. So the study concludes that the multifaceted approach is sustainable and cost-effective. So these are some of the good practices that I wanted to present you in this fifth and last webinar of RNSF. And you will be able to find most of these projects presented and these good practices and lessons learned in the publication of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacques, for your presentation. It's a lot of material, and I would like just to show our participants the material available, because there is a lot of material related to good practices, and not only, and so maybe they want to go more in depth and have more details. So Pierre, if you can give me access to present my, thank you. Okay. So what we have here is the series of volumes that RNSF produced over 4 years. There are 9 volumes available in total. And the first volume is a reference guide for the readers, so you can have an idea of all the material, and there will be links to access the material. Then we have volume 2 is on the defining the informal economy, where you find the concept, key concept, trends, characteristics of the informal economy, while volume 3 address the policies of the informal economy. It's a global review of approaches and policies from donors and other stakeholders working in the field of informal economy. Volume 4, point 1, point 2, 3, and 4 are volumes related to the analysis of what we can learn from experiences, so from projects. And we have volume 4.1, 4.3, and 4.4, which are related to project funded by the European Union, specifically the project funded in the thematic program Investing in People in 2009 and 2014. And you have an analysis of these good practices, while in volume 4.3 you have the good practices extracted from other 15 projects also funded by the EU that are not directly related to the informal economy, but they are working with groups also of informal workers. So that's why we have analyzed them. Volume 4.2 is a meta-evaluation of 200, more than 200 studies, evaluation from international agencies, from the UN families, and also other cooperation like the FID. And you have recommendations coming from this organization, structured and clustered by areas and topics related to the informal economy. Volume 5 and 6 are 2 books related to 2 topics that we selected together with the Unit B3 at DEFCO, and we have worked on social protection and on the organization of informal workers. One is in English and the other one is in Spanish. We're going to translate also the one in Spanish and English. These were built, written with the participants of 2 regional workshops that we implemented in Kenya and in Peru, with CSOs, members, ILO officers, academics, regional experts, and together we use the methodology to co-author a book presenting their experience. All these volumes will be digitalized and put on the DEFCO Academy, which is a platform of DEFCO where you have a lot of resources. They have publications, they have e-learning courses on different topics, and all the volumes will be available there entirely. But we realized that there was a need also to disseminate the findings of the research in a more accessible way. That's why, as example, we have decided to implement these 5 webinars as a sort of introduction to the volumes that we produced. And you have here the list of webinars that we have implemented so far. They're all available at this link. We record each webinar, including the one we are doing today, and then they are available at this address. The presentation will be shared after the webinar, so you can access directly on our platform, which is RNSF, hosted on Capacity for Dev. And you have the 4 webinars that are, again, related to the key content of our research volume. So the definition, key concept, the policies and approaches, social protection, organizing, and good practices. We are finalizing also an e-learning course, which is an introduction with a key concept related to the informal economy. Again, we're following the same structure. There is a module on defining the informal economy, another one on policies and approaches tackling the informal economy, and the third one is a tutorial to access all the research material that we have posted online. At the moment, we have another group that we also established on Capacity for Dev. It's a management information tool where all the information and research material available in the volumes are accessible. Also here you have the address, so you can directly access to the platform. There are 4 sections in this site. The 4 sections are again related to the key areas of our research. So you have defining the informal economy, you have the recommendation, you have good practices and lessons learned, and you have the policies and approaches addressing the informal economy. So we thought that that was a way to make more easy to access specific information without maybe having to read a whole volume of 150 or 200 pages. If you're interested on a specific chapter, as example of the section related to defining the informal economy, like the basic concept or the statistical trends or the characteristics, you can just access the section and go to the chapter that you want to analyze or to read more in depth. Also for the good practices, like the ones that today Jacques presented, you have the possibility to go and download also for each good practice a PDF. It's a good practice fiche where you have key information about the project, the context, how the good practice was developed, etc. So we really hope that with this you can have an access to our material, and for today it's more than enough information, I guess. And maybe we can now give the floor for questions. And as usual, I will ask Pierre to during the process, during the webinar, he has collected questions from participants. So I don't know if you have already collected question. Maybe before giving the floor to Pierre, I would ask also participants if they have question now, they can raise their hand. Maybe Pierre, you could remind how they can do this, and then we can answer directly.
Okay. Yeah. Hello. For the moment, not so many questions, and nobody has raised his hand or her hand so far. Just as a reminder, you can do it by having a look at the control panel, which should be on your right. You should see a small hand, and if you click on this and I will be able to give you the possibility to ask questions. There were maybe just 2 questions were sent previously or indicated during the presentation. It's related to the best practices which have been presented in the presentation. People are asking questions regarding the replicability in their own context. Basically, the main question would be about these good practices, the one which were presented, or others which are in our database. Are they? How can the replicability can be assessed to different contexts?
Okay. Yeah. Jack, you want to say something on this point?
Well, yes. Replicability can be assessed only if it has already been done by actors. And for instance, this is the case of the last good practices that I presented about BRAC, because it has been replicated in 8 countries, and through adaptation, of course, and taking into account the context and the type of population that have been reached. So unless same actors or given institutions is replicating the same project in other countries or in other regions in the same countries, it is not possible to say that it is a replica. So this is why initially I said that these criteria of definition of a good practice were difficult to evaluate and to score. In fact, this is why we just have to assess our achievements only on qualitative and quantitative information that we can collect after the project. But this is, of course, the main issue and the main problem to be tackled, replicability.
Okay, I would like to add something on this point of replicability, because many times when we look at good practice, we focus on the activity that was implemented. While I think that when you think about replicability, you should take a step backward and look not at the activity, but at the problem that this activity wanted to solve. And in this case, the first step for replicability, in my opinion, is to try to do in the new context when you want to apply the good practice developed in another context, to redo the assessment of the problems and needs in order to understand if those needs are similar as example, why informal workers are not accessing to a good job. Is it a problem of skills? Is it a problem of access to market? Is it a problem of the lack of recognition of their competence? If you analyze the issues that they face, then you can understand in the first place if the problems that you want to try to tackle are similar to the context where the original good practice was developed. And that is a sort of analysis that allows an adaptation of the good practice to the specific needs. And the second thing that I would also like to add is the analysis of the stakeholders, especially government and institutions, public bodies. As example, I remember that in Uganda, where you have this a good practice on how to recognize the skills of informal workers and give them a recognition through a pass, which assess your skills irrespectively of where you have acquired the skill, meaning not necessarily in a formal training, but on the job training as example. There was the idea to extend this good practice to other countries. It was developed in Uganda. In this case, the Yuga Privi, which is the authority in charge of assessing the quality of vocational training and recognizing the skills and issuing also and preparing the test, was involved in the project. And that was, a way to start establishing contact with other authorities in other countries. I remember in Kenya and in Tanzania, in order to understand if this authority were also interested in going through a similar process. So the analysis of the problems to understand if we can give the same answer, the same activity to another context, and the analysis of the stakeholders to have their involvement are two key steps to do replicability. Many times we have seen projects trying to replicate something, focusing a lot on the activity. So they start analyzing what they did in another context, and they try to do the same steps, the same kind of activity, but without analyzing the problems and analyzing the stakeholders. The risk is that the replicability will just not fit in a new context.
And can I have the microphone? Yeah. Yes. What I can add also is that in many of the projects and the good practices that have been presented just now in this last webinar, but also in the previous, is that there is something that is common to many good practices. It is the incentivization of the administration in charge of an action to be conducted for the informal economy. Because as I said in my presentation, it is not to the people to go to the offices to benefit from an allowance or of something that is provided by the government, but it is rather to this administration to go to the populations to make them aware of the availability of the allowance or some projects. And we can see that this is applied in many cases by the project. In Ghana, for instance, the support to the health insurance scheme, the support to the microfinance institutions, and it was also observed in Togo with the delegation for the organization of the informal sector, or in Côte d'Ivoire with the GESCO. So this, in a way, is an example of the replicability of the actions of the projects in order to support the population dependent on the informal economy.
Thank you, Jacques. Any other question, Pierre? We cannot hear you, Pierre.
Sorry. Yes, there is a question from from Mukaila. If you are still okay and still connected, Mukaila, I'm going to give you the floor. I hope that the connection will be good enough.
Hello.
Yeah,
Can you
hello,
hear
Mr.
me?
Mukaila. Ready,
Yes.
ready to listen to you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mukaila Ojelade. I'm a retired staff of the African Development Bank after 26 years in public sector. This is a very useful program. I just have two quick questions for Jack. One, do you consider the administrative costs or the cultural barriers for this kind of program so high that it outweighs the benefits? That's question number one. And secondly, what should be your recommendation for multinational development banks like African Development Bank to get more involved in the formal sector? Because the emphasis usually seems to be on the public sector. And we'll talk of investment, we look at the private sector, but for those which are able to generate the positive balances. So what would you recommend as a kind of attraction? What can be done for the MDBs like ADB to be able to get involved more in the informal sector, especially in the programs that can generate this kind of benefit that you have ably outlined during your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. I just mute for a second, Mr. Mukaila. I'll to let Jacques and Paolo answer, but I will give the floor back to Mukaila afterwards.
So thank you very much for your questions. I hope that I will be able to respond more in depth on the website of RNSF. But for the moment, what I would like to say about your last questions about the actions of international institutions and especially the African Development Bank for actions about the informal sector. I would like to say that these kind of actors, the regional banks or the World Bank, are more and more involved in the informal economy and the informal sector particularly, in that it deals with micro businesses. As we explain in the volume on the global policy reviews, these international institutions have been more and more involved since 2015 with the adoption of the recommendation 204 by the International Labour Conference on the transition from the informal to the formal economy. In fact, this recommendation provide a global framework for countries to design national policies for the transition to the formal economy. And it is currently under applications in several African countries. For instance, in Togo, in Madagascar, in Burkina Faso. Policies are going to be designed to ensure the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And within these national policies, the support and the financing of some of the aspects of these policies by the regional banks can be of help to ensure this transition. And it is ongoing in some countries. For instance, to provide credit adapted to small businesses, or to ensure that employment created the jobs created are decent. So there are plenty of ways for regional banks to be involved in these new policies that are designed for the transition to the formal economy. And your first questions about cultural barriers. I didn't hear well the beginning of the questions, but it was mainly about do these projects take into account the cultural barriers? Well, of course, the grassroots organization in charge of the implementation of the project that are funded by the European Commission or other international institutions. So these organizations are working at the field level with the populations, and they are able to adapt their actions to the real needs of the population. So in a way, coming back to the policies to support the transition from the informal to the formal economy, I would say that the social and solidarity economy and the grassroots organizations are part of this social and solidarity economy. Well, the social and solidarity economy is a major actor of this transition. And so much of the support of the international institutions and of the regional banks can be provided through these kind of organizations. But I will try to respond to you more deeply in, on the website of ISF.
Thank you, Jacques. I just want to add something on the involvement of private sector in the formal economy and the national development banks and other banks. Just to integrate what Jacques said, there is an interesting study which is for Latin America actually, because it's an evaluation of a program of the ILO, which is called FORLAC, which stands for Formalization in Latin American and Caribbean. If you Google evaluation FORLAC is FORLAC. You can download the document. It was done in 2017, December 2017, and it's an initial assessment of what is going on in terms of implementing the recommendation 204 of 2015, the one Jacques mentioned on the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And a huge part is dedicated of the involvement of private sectors and the investment in taking into consideration the needs of informal workers. There is also recognition that in many countries analyzed in Latin America, the informal economy is huge part of the economy in key sectors like mining, construction, transportation, where a huge percentage of workers are informal. So there is also recognition that they are sustaining the growth and the economy of their countries, and there is the need to adapt the investment and the intervention to their needs. It's an interesting document. I would suggest to access it.
Mukaila, I don't know if you have other comments or other questions following the feedback of Paolo and Jacques. Maybe he cannot connect anymore. Okay.
Let's see if there is any other question.
Well, we are getting a bit in the end of the session now, but I don't see other question except maybe a last one regarding the good practices. So of course, I mean, all our project was about analyzing a significant number of projects. There was some question regarding if we have also worked on other databases of good practices of other platforms of specific institutions in the work we gathered about in which we gathered all these best practices. We don't hear you.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so the volume 4.2 is about good practices of projects funded by other institutions than the EU. And among these institutions, there is the ILO, the FAO, the World Bank, the DFID, SIDA, etc. So of course we looked at the platform and the database of these institutions to see what they say about good practices in their project, in the project that they have funded. But probably there are some other database that we could have used and that we didn't use. Well, the domain is so wide that it is impossible to be exhaustive. So this is why the IESF platform was an opportunity to exchange and to share good practices with other institutions and practitioners.
Thank you, Jacques. So I think that maybe we can close our webinar today. Thanks to all participants for attending. And if you have other questions, you can write them. And as we did for the previous webinar, we're going to answer on our platform IESF. You have the IESF platform in this slide presentation. And thank you very much for today, and thank you, Jacques, for your interesting presentation, and Pierre for your support as usual. And goodbye. Have a nice day, everyone.
Goodbye to all.
Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.